I knocked on the heavy oak door as politely as a woman who had once been welcomed into every hearth could. The bell chimed and she opened it, smiling with the practiced warmth of a hostess. And then, as if a curtain had fallen between us, she looked at me like I was a stranger. What made that look worse was the way my daughter's hand slid from mine as though she had been burned. I remember the exact second. The clock above the piano read 10:15 a.m. The sunlight spilled across the marble foyer, and I felt my bones, which had carried me through births and funerals, stiffen with that old sharp surprise one learns to dread. Was this really my own child speaking on that marble threshold? I tell you now with the simple honesty of someone who has kept coins in a mason jar for 30 years, nothing begins like thunder. Betrayal begins with small ignitions, the misplaced letter, the hesitation in a voice, a monthly transfer whose purpose is explained away. For 5 years my husband, God rest his absent heart, sent a small sum every month to his sister, $150 at first, then $300, then $500, what he called help for her troubles. I believed him, because what else does a wife believe when the ledger of life has long patterns and you have bent your back to keep the ledger balanced? How easily we ledger our lives until someone else writes in the margins. My name is Maria. I live with my chipped mug that has a hairline crack from when my eldest was born, and a mason jar on the top shelf where I keep coins for small mercies, bus fare, a coffee for a visiting neighbor, stamps for letters. I have an old string of pearls that belonged to my mother, the pearls that my daughter once adored and that I wore because I liked the memory of their coolness at my throat. Once, long before these doors closed on me, my daughter and I would sit on the kitchen floor and sort through the coins in the jar like children, laughing because the pennies were always lighter than we remembered. That ordinary warmth was my world. I do not live in poverty. Fate was not cruel enough to take that from me. I live modestly in a small house I refurbished with my own hands. But my daughter's life, since she married into money, had become a house of glass and marble and carefully curated distances. She and her husband, Julian, built a life that smelled faintly of new leather and citrus-scented cleaner. Rooms that looked like advertisements. They had the sort of prosperity that makes ordinary things, like a mason jar of coins, appear quaint, an artifact from a simpler era. The first time I set my chipped mug on their dining table, I felt embarrassed, as if I had arrived wearing yesterday's shoes to a masquerade. I thought nothing of it. Mothers are used to feeling out of step. It began as the smallest of pretexts. On April 3rd, 2 days before their anniversary gala, which they arranged every spring to fundraise and to be seen, Julian called me at 9 a.m. to ask me to bring over a casserole and some of my lemon cake. "Everyone loves your cake, Mama," he said. In his voice was the casual warmth that had softened many of my days. I chopped lemons and dusted sugar and wrapped the cake in wax paper. When I arrived, I found the house humming with caterers and flowers. I placed the cake in the kitchen and went to the living room where my daughter, Elena, received me with that faltering smile. She kissed my cheek. She told me to sit. Her hand lay on mine for a second, long enough to be reassuring, and then she rose and excused herself. When she returned, she did not sit. That afternoon, I learned of small dissipations that, when stitched together, made a pattern I wished had not become clear. I found a bank statement tucked under a napkin in the drawer where they kept the canapes. It was Julian's, account number ending in 4219, and there, line after line, month after month, was a transfer labeled simply Family Assistance. At first, I thought it was nothing more than good-natured charity. $210 on January 5th, $320 on February 5th, $450 on March 5th, always the 5th, always steady. At the bottom of one page, scrawled in a handwriting I recognized as Julian's, neat, almost mechanical, was a note. For Anna, keep for her. Anna was his sister's name. My hands, that afternoon, trembled in a way I had thought only childbirth could cause. I tucked the statement into my purse like a mischievous child hiding a forbidden candy. When I asked Julian about it later that week, he smiled that same small smile and said, "We help family. Maria, it's nothing for you to worry over." He called it nothing. and the word sank like a stone into my chest. I returned to my mason jar and counted the coins under the lamp as if counting could measure trust. The first micro cliffhanger came to me on a tray of canapés. There was a folded letter addressed to Anna, and it smelled faintly of jasmine. Elena's exclusion was like a cold draft that began at the windowsill and found its way into the bed. Invitations arrived without my name, parties where my laughter had once felt like a welcomed ingredient. Her voice over the phone shortened conversations until I found myself apologizing for old jokes. The softest of slights is still a blade when sintered over time. It cut. I could have stood, I suppose, and fought like a younger woman. Instead, I did what many mothers do. I quieted myself so as not to disturb what I thought of as my daughter's new life. After all, had I not been the one to tuck her in at night? To scrape her scraped knees? To sew a prom dress? Yet there is a point at which silence becomes complicity, and for reasons the heart only later explains, I let that silence settle like dust. But there were things I could not let fall to dust. The pearls, for instance. Once, when my daughter was a child of 6, she had asked to hold them, and I let her thread them through her small fingers. She had winked at me, told me she would wear them at her wedding day. I kept those pearls wrapped in a handkerchief where the sun did not touch them, because some things are both jewel and promise. I had also kept a letter, a small yellowed envelope, in a locked box beneath the false bottom of the cedar chest. The lock was old and gave a reluctant protest when I turned the key. The box held a photograph, a train ticket, and a note from a man who had not been kind. It was my private history. Every time I turned that key, I remembered where I began and how I survived. The more I observed, the more the transfers seemed less like charity and more like a secret architecture. The amounts rose: $620 in June, $1,000 in September, and with each increase the explanations grew thinner. A loan, a medical bill, just some help. On October 12th, found an envelope stamped with the return address of a nursing home in another town, Anna's town. Inside was a photocopy of a document, Durant and Myers Attorneys, a firm that Julian consulted for personal matters. The photocopy bore the words "Durable Power of Attorney." The name signed at the bottom, as if on a breadcrumb trail meant to be followed, was Elena's. But the signature beside it, oh, God forgive me the sight, looked eerily like my own handwriting. I know the shape of my letters. I write slowly, curling my T's like anchors. Someone had taken the pen and written in my stead. I started to watch the house not with suspicion, but with a simple, practical eyes, like an old gardener watching for blight. I listened for voices, for the creak of soles on the stair, for the rustle of paper. One evening at 8:05 p.m., I overheard Elena on the phone in the hallway. Her voice, which I had once known in lullabies, spoke in a measured tone. "No, it's done. The durable power of attorney is signed. The last will and testament will be amended next week." She said it like she was arranging flowers. There was a clinking that might have been cutlery, a laugh brittle as glass, and then she said quietly, "Don't worry about Mama. She'll accept it." That was the second micro cliffhanger. I froze in the doorway and heard my life being refiled without my consent. I had to be careful. Anger, like a stovetop left too high, can burn. I am old enough to know the value of a slow, patient heat. I began to keep records. I made copies of bank statements, annotated them with dates and amounts. I wrote the times I heard conversations in a small notebook, the same one I had once used to jot down late-night recipes, and kept it under my mattress where, in youth, I had hidden letters. At night, I would sit with my pearls on, one by one rolling them through my fingers as if I could count back the moments that led here. It comforted me in a way that felt almost like prayer. I remember the October afternoon when I confronted Elena with the photocopy. I sat at her kitchen table, a table that had a perfect shine and an absence of crumbs, and placed the paper between us like a gauntlet. She looked at it, and for a moment, something less practiced flickered across her face. A shadow, as if memory had opened a drawer that should have remained closed. "Where did you get this?" she asked. Her voice had a flavor of surprise that could be either honest or practiced. I did not yet know which. "Just a copy," I said. "From the nursing home's mail?" It was true. I had been pretending to be careless. I watched the lie as it moved across her like a parade. She told me that the durable power of attorney had been signed in a moment of prudence, that older people make arrangements so their affairs do not become burdens. The phrase burden is an old weapon. "Mama, we did this so you would never be alone in making decisions," she said, and there was that look again, the look of someone who had rehearsed their lines. I felt like a character in a play who had missed her cue. My hands, which had folded diapers and clutched steering wheels in storms, trembled so badly that I almost dropped the chipped mug I had carried into the room. The third micro cliffhanger landed on the heel of that trembling. Elena had the durable power of attorney document folded inside her Bible, which brings me to the small, domestic things that betray us. A tea stain on a page, a lock left unlocked, the slight indentation on a sofa where someone sits often. For days I watched the Bible as if it were a small sun around which the truth orbited. I found a way, because stubbornness is a craft, to lift a corner of the page and see the fold of paper. The signature looked like mine enough to be plausible to the casual glance, but under the magnifying glass of a woman's life, it revealed hesitations, the wrong pressure on the downstrokes. I could feel my skin prickle with a cold realization. Someone had forged my hand. I am not a lawyer. I have no formal education beyond the school where I learned to read and to make a bargain with Stu. But life teaches you its own laws. I went to Durant and Myers. The receptionist said they closed at 5:30. It was 5:20. I walked into their office and sat like a woman who had no right to be there, and yet the paper I held was a right more sacred than any door. The attorney who took my case, young, careful, and not yet dead to surprise, looked at the photocopy and then at me. I told him the dates. April 3rd, the bank transfers on the 5th of every month. Amounts totaling about $230,000 over the last 5 years, if you add them roughly. $1,000 here, $620 there. He nodded as if he had expected such arithmetic from a woman with a mason jar. He said, "We will need originals, Mrs. Alvarez. We will need to see the bank statements and the original durable power of attorney." He said it gently. And there was the comfort of procedure, a small, precise thing that promises fairness. And yet, when I asked for the originals, doors closed with the artificial politeness that money can teach. Julian's secretary told me everything was digitized. Elena offered me a cup of tea, and the house smelled like orange blossom and pretense. She said softly, "Mama, please, we can handle this for you." I put my hand to the pearls beneath my blouse, as if to steady my heart. The pearls had always been my memory. They were my miniature map back to who I had been. I left the house that evening feeling like a woman who had been given a map where the ink had been smudged. One night, late, I sat at my kitchen table and opened the mason jar. The coins clinked under the lamp like small accusations. I counted. There was less in the jar than there should have been for a woman who uses coins for small kindnesses. I could not explain why the absence of a few coins felt catastrophic, but it did, the way a missing word can change an entire sentence. The next day, determined, I went back to the house with a quiet resolve. If doors were closed, windows might be open. If signatures were forged, shadows might still slip. The fourth micro cliffhanger carried itself in a single line that night. I found a locked drawer I had never known existed. Do not imagine I tell this as one who delights in the drama of pain. I tell it the way someone would tell of a storm, because the truth is weather, and because truth, once found, must be named. I sat in my chair, the light from the street lamp making the pearls gleam like small moons, and I felt the old, steady surge of something fierce and necessary. The plays of my youth taught me many things, how silence can be a blade, how a name can be a prison. But what they did not teach me was how one small, determined woman, with a mason jar and a memory and a stubborn hand, could begin to untie the knots of a life that had been knotted by another's greed. "Justice," I whispered to the empty room, because sometimes saying the word aloud gives it shape. The house seemed to listen. The night breathed. And in the morning, I would knock again on the door where my daughter lived and see whether the smile would hide a dagger or merely a tired face. At the end of a life's chapter, there are always those elevated, moral moments where truth seems to sit in the place of a throne. I learned bitterly and slowly that love gives and law sometimes takes, that the hand that signs for you may write your silence into permanence, and that dignity is both a jewel and an accusation, beautiful, and dangerous if left unguarded. I closed the leather notebook and slid it beneath my mattress, because some weapons are more useful kept under one's pillow than in the light. The last thing I did before I left the house that morning was fasten the pearls to my throat. They hummed against my collarbone like a small, steady bell, and I felt, for the first time in many months, less like a woman who had been pushed aside and more like someone who was about to call the Count to duel. I never expected what I would find in that drawer. The clock in my kitchen had stopped at 7:40 p.m. The week my life became less tolerable and more purposeful. I suppose even clocks, when they refuse to march forward, teach us that time sometimes needs to be wound by human hands. I wound it that night and set it by the small truth I had discovered. A locked drawer, a Bible with a paper folded inside, a photocopy from Durant and Myers whispering of a durable power of attorney that bore my name like an accusation. I had come for answers and found the dark corridors that questions make. After my visit to Durant and Myers, the young attorney, Mr. Cortez, had promised action. He had the quiet of men who have read too many contracts and yet have not lost the sense of justice that must lie behind a law degree. "We will need originals," he told me again, "and a handwriting expert if there's a suggestion of forgery. I will subpoena Julian's bank records and request the bank to produce the original transfer authorizations. We'll need the notarized durable power of attorney and whoever witnessed it." His voice reminded me of the precise measure of a surgeon. I felt a small comfort in the precision of procedure. I began to assemble proof the way a woman gathers herbs, carefully, with knowledge that a recipe becomes medicine only when mixed with patience. I went back to the house one afternoon, on September 1st, at 2:30 p.m., under the pretext of bringing over some lemon cake. Elena answered the door in a blouse that cost more than my monthly groceries, and she smiled like someone who had learned to hide knives. She took the cake with a practiced dip of the wrist and set it on the counter without offering a taste. "Mama, we're busy," she said. There was a detachment to those words that made them sound like official statements. Inside, I moved quietly. I had learned the habit of small stealths, how to peer into a drawer without making a sound, how to lift the corner of a Bible page with the gentleness of a woman who has cradled infants, of a woman who has read stories at bedtime and knows how to turn pages without tearing them. My hands found the Bible. The paper was there, folded and warm with the scent of another person's perfume. When I slid the photocopy free, I discovered more than I expected. Beneath the copy of the durable power of attorney lay an envelope addressed to Anna, the return address that matched the nursing home, and a postmarked date, March 14th, 2024. On the back of the envelope, in handwriting not mine but in a hurried scrawl, was a phone number. I memorized the number by the way sailors memorize stars, a faint, steady ritual. I called that number at 9:10 that night, because courage often arrives late and only after we have measured our fears. The voice that answered belonged to a woman who said she was Anna's nurse. "Mrs. Alvarez? Anna talks sometimes," the nurse said. The words tumbled out, and then, in the center of what she was willing to admit, she said, "Anna mentioned a man named Julian. She said he sent money monthly. But she said something else too. She said Elena told her to tell people Mama had signed over power." The nurse sounded tired, as if the truth was exhaustible. I wrote down the nurse's name, the time, and the exact words. I felt the small machine of my case beginning to fire on more cylinders. I am not an investigator by profession. I am a woman who once nailed a loose board on a porch and mended a boy's torn trousers with a stubborn thread. But when people wish to hide something, they create threads that lead somewhere: an account number, a postmarked envelope, a nursing home note, and the woman who remembers the shape of her own signature can follow those threads. I returned to Durant and Myers with the postmarked envelope, the nurse's name, and the photocopy. Mr. Cortez sat with a glass of water, his fingers steepled like a man who owns nothing but principles. He called in a handwriting expert, Dr. Marina Alvarez, relation, and she arrived the next day with a magnifying loupe and a patience that felt like conscience. She compared the signature. On the durable power of attorney, with other samples of my handwriting, my old library card signature, the margin notes in a recipe book where I instructed my children on how to fold a pastry, the signature on a promissory note my husband had once signed. Forgery has a temperament, she said, peering, and her words were like a small bell. The pressure is wrong here. The downstrokes lack commitment. A forger will often hesitate on letters like R and S. There is hesitation on your T's. She pronounced the word with the authority of someone who has read the same lie in many hands. The document, she declared, bore all the faint signatures of a hand that had copied, not owned. The letters. I remember the way the room smelled, polished wood and ink, and how, for a fragile moment, the world rearranged itself so that truth and law sat opposite each other like old enemies. Mr. Cortez filed a motion to impound the original documents. He requested Julian's bank records going back 5 years, and he served a subpoena on the nursing home for Anna's records and the mail log. The legal system can feel like a slow vessel, and yet it moves with a momentum once it is set in motion. I felt that momentum like a tide under my feet. The micro cliffhanger came like a soft, terrible sound. I found a draft email on Julian's laptop. Julian, of course, did not welcome a woman poking into the quiet mechanisms that fed his household. He answered my questions with smiles and a practiced confusion that suggested I had misread things. Maria, he said once, at 4:45 p.m. in the sunroom where he received guests, I would never do anything to harm you. The funds are for Anna's care. His voice was the voice of a man who had rehearsed his innocence. But I had seen the transfers. I had seen the increases. I had seen the durable power of attorney. I had the handwriting expert's conclusions. Where are the originals? I asked. He told me they were locked away with Durant and Myers, but Mr. Cortez had already told me that his office had no such originals in their custody. They had only the photocopy provided by Anna's home. Something did not fit. While the lawyer pursued documents, I pursued people. People talk when the walls have a scent of fear. I visited old neighbors who had known Julian when he was not yet gilded with money. I visited Anna's last landlord and the woman who used to deliver groceries to the nursing home. Each visit gave me a small shard of truth, that Anna had been seen receiving letters, that she had once spoken of a nephew who sent payments, that she had been visited by a woman who looked similar to Elena once in the spring of 2024. The shards made a mosaic that felt ugly and inevitable. One evening, as I was sorting these shards on my kitchen table, Mr. Cortez called. He had received an email from the bank, an internal note attached to Julian's account. There had been a pattern flagged by the bank's fraud department. Multiple beneficiary transfers to an account in a different name, with authorization forms that bore my name. The bank had kept the originals, they said, and their compliance officer would testify to the transfers. My chest tightened with a curious relief. The bank records, numbers, times, confirmations, were the kind of thing that made a lawyer smile. I set the chipped mug to my lips and drank as if it were a chalice of vindication. My daughter, in the days that followed, changed. The practiced smile grew thin, and the circles beneath her eyes deepened like water stains on plaster. In a conversation I overheard at 10:50 a.m. while pretending to dust a shelf, a skillful ruse, let me tell you, she said to someone on speakerphone, "We can delay. Mama will not know the difference until it's done." She used the royal "we" that men use when they make conspiracies sound like families. I felt something cold run down my back. The pattern of exclusion was not only financial now, but surgical in its cruelty. Then came a little miracle in the form of a human error. Julian had printed a draft of an email and, in his haste, left it in the family room. The email was addressed to Anna, to an address that matched Anna's account, and it read partially, "Payment schedule adjusted. Increase to $1,200 starting 09/05/24. Durable POA finalized. Elena to handle documents." It was dated September 4th, 2024, and signed with Julian's name. I felt the document like a slap that wakes you and a hand that steadies you. I photographed it with my phone, hands trembling, and sent the image to Mr. Cortez. He replied with a single sentence, "We file this in court." At this point, the house of my daughter's life began to creak. Friends who once admired the couple's social gatherings began to murmur to me about odd bills being charged, about Elena's terse manner with vendors, about a niece named Anna who was suddenly the beneficiary of strange kindnesses. A woman I had once tutored in making jam, a woman named Rosa, brought over a small stack of letters she had received in error. One letter bore the bank account routing number. Another was a copy of a check made out to Anna and signed by Julian. The numbers were precise: $3,600 a month for certain months in 2023 that matched the bank drafts. When I added them, when Mr. Cortez added them, we came to a figure that was no longer quaint, close to $230,000 over the years. Money becomes a narrative when you see the handwriting of it. It is important perhaps to say how I felt in all of this. I was not a woman who wanted revenge for the flavor of the word. Revenge is an opera, loud, dramatic, and sometimes empty. What I desired was restitution, the slow, legal kind that mends wrongs with signatures and testimony. But there were moments when I allowed myself a certain opera, the idea that someone who had catalogued dignity could have theirs catalogued back. In the middle of a courthouse hallway, under the buzzing fluorescent lights, I could almost hear Dumas himself whispering that a wrong, once known, must be answered with a certain generous cruelty. The measure of a woman is not taken by the weight of her pearls, but by the sharpness with which she reclaims them. That was the little Dumas aside I would murmur to myself when I felt too tired to continue. The legal filings began in earnest. Mr. Cortez filed a petition to declare the durable power of attorney void for forgery. He petitioned for an emergency temporary restraining order to stop any transfer of assets pending a full hearing. The judge, an older woman with silver hair who wore her robes like armor, granted the temporary restraining order on September 20th, 2024. At 11 a.m., her gavel rap echoing like a bell, I sat in the courtroom with my pearls, the ones that had kept me company for years, and I felt both like a supplicant and like a sovereign. The clerk called the case, Alvarez vs. Julian Ricardo Martinez, petition to void durable power of attorney. The name written in the docket felt like a path opening through a forest. The micro cliffhanger came with the judge's last question. Was Mrs. Alvarez of sound mind when these documents were allegedly signed? This was the maneuver they had practiced, to question my mental clarity, to paint an old woman as forgetful, pliable, fragile. I did not flinch. I told the judge my dates: April 3rd, the dates of transfers on the 5th of each month, the photocopy from the nursing home postmarked March 14th, 2024. I spoke of the handwriting expert, of the photocopies, of the draft email. Mr. Cortez presented the bank's internal memo and the subpoenaed records. Elena sat to my right, her makeup a mask too thin to hold. She had the look of someone who was both bored and furious, worn by fear. Julian's lawyer tried to argue that the documents were valid, that Anna was a legitimate beneficiary, that the durable power of attorney had been signed in a moment of prudence. The judge listened with the sort of patience only the law permits. She asked for continuance and set a hearing for October 6th, a date that was, for me, a small bright nail on which I might hang my hope. When I left the courthouse, the sun had the brittle edge of a late September afternoon. I walked home slower than I might have, feeling the weight of each footfall as if each step were a word in a sentence that had not yet reached its period. I had roused more than the legal system. I had woken a truth that would not sleep easily. People began to speak to me on the street with lowered voices. One man handed me, as if it were contraband, a USB thumb drive. "Found it in the office copier," he said. "Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's everything." My hands closed around the drive like a hunter clasping a prize. That night, with the magnifying loupe borrowed from Dr. Marina and under the small lamp that had once guided me through mending sleeves, I plugged in the USB. There were photos, dozens of documents, of sweeps of handwriting samples, of bank forms. There were also videos. I clicked on one, and it played a meeting recorded, perhaps accidentally, on March 11th, 2024, at 3:17 p.m., in a room that smelled to me of the same citrus cleaner Julian used. Elena sat across from Anna. Julian stood by the door. The camera was angled in a way that suggested it had been left on a shelf. They spoke of schedules, of payments, of signatures. Elena's voice, my daughter's voice, was low but firm. We just need the power finalized. Mother will sign something. She thinks it's a health directive. Anna, in a brittle whisper, said, I can't remember much. Elle, you know that. Elena's hand, my daughter's hand, reached across the table and smoothed Anna's fingers like a woman who is calming a child. You'll say what we need, Elena told her. You'll say I'm the one she trusts. We'll make it tidy, Julian laughed softly. Schedule the transfers for the 5th, he said. We'll keep it regular. I stopped the video because my hands shook so badly that I thought they would spill my tea. The final micro cliffhanger, before the turning moment, was simple and brutal. The camera had captured my daughter's face when she looked up. At that instant, the world shifted. I had the video. In a legal sense, a recording of conspiracy is a wieldy sword. In a moral sense, it was the terrible revelation of a child's betrayal. With that single file in my hands, the choice before me was no longer whether to fight, but how loudly. I could file everything with the court and let the law do what it must. Or I could, in the small private way I always preferred, confront her first. I chose both, because the law can move with its measured grace. And because some wrongs demand the dignity of a direct naming, I called Elena and asked to meet at 7 p.m. on September 28, 2024. She arrived with those thin smiles that feel like curtains. I laid the USB on the table. Her fingers went pale as if the room's air had been sucked away. Mama, she said, and in that single syllable there was the immense convenience of a daughter who had not expected to be named a criminal by the one she had betrayed. I watched her face as I told her, simply, that I had the video, that Mr. Cortez had the bank memo, and that Durant and Myers had been unable to produce original POA documents in their files. She tried to reach for excuses, concern for Anna's health, mistakes in paperwork, the thinnest of rationales. But the words were paper-thin against the file of truth I had assembled. Before she could turn the conversation like a spatula and flip the pan of blame, Elvis, our old neighbor who had always had a soft place in his heart for me, knocked on the kitchen window and lifted his hand. He carried in his other hand a small envelope that had been left in his mailbox earlier that day, an invoice for $15,000, sent to Elena's name from a company that specialized in estate settlements. The sight of the invoice, the email draft, the bank memo, and the video together made a corridor of accusation through the room. She covered her face and cried in a way that seemed both real and orchestrated. I sat, my pearls cold at my throat, and felt not the triumph of revenge, but the clarity of a woman who had been pushed and who would not be shoved again. The Dumas aside came to me, not in words I would say aloud in a kitchen, but in the way an old moral floats above a scene. Vengeance, said the old books, is a double-edged blade that spares neither the guilty nor the just. Yet justice, oh justice, has the look of a woman who stands in daylight and calls what was hidden into the open. I sent the video to Durant and Myers, to Mr. Cortez, and to the judge. I filed the motions that would make the evidence public in a hearing on October 6th. Elena pleaded, then begged, then accused me of falsehoods. Julian called me a liar on the phone in a voice so raw that I could hear the strain beneath the roar. Friends took sides. The press, small and hungry, smelled scandal and came to the courthouse steps asking for statements. I gave them none. I had not come to make a spectacle. I had come to reclaim what was mine and to prevent others from being made to live small by the greed of those who thought themselves entitled. And then, 2 days before the hearing, something happened I had not expected. A package arrived at my door at 6:30 a.m. with no return address. Inside was a single piece of paper folded like a confession. When I opened it, the words were few and tremulous, written in a hand I did not recognize. I was paid, it said. I signed because I was scared. Anna. I felt at that moment the strange, dizzying mix of victory and horror. For every confession is a wound and a balm at the same time. The package had cost someone courage, and that courage would have consequences. I placed the paper beside the pearls and sat down, feeling like a woman who had suddenly been promoted from spectator to general. I never expected how the next morning would begin. The courthouse smelled like old paper and lemon oil, the kind of scent that tells you the world will keep its rules if you insist on them. I had slept poorly the night before, the pearls around my throat a small, cold comfort against the tremor of anticipation. When I arrived on October 6, 2024, at 9:30 a.m., the courtroom was already humming with the low, serious noise of people who know their futures might be rearranged by the morning. Mr. Cortez sat beside me like a man prepared for a long battle. Dr. Marina Alvarez had her loupe and a folder of microscopic photographs. The bank's compliance officer, Ms. Patel, carried a thick envelope of originals and a statute of certification. I took my seat and felt, in the steadiness of my palms, an odd rising calm. We began with small, precise things. The judge, Judge Miriam Valdez, a woman with silver hair and the patient glare of someone who has read too many human contradictions, called the case at 10:02 a.m. She wore the robe like a mantle and spoke in the cadence of someone who understood both law and sorrow. Mr. Cortez presented the photocopy, then the handwriting expert's comparison, then the bank's originals, transfer authorizations, routing numbers, wire confirmations stamped with precise dates, 05/05/19, 05/05/20, 05/05/21, each annotated by the bank's fraud desk. The numbers added up like a sick arithmetic lesson, roughly $230,000 in transfers over 5 years, much of it routed to the same nursing home account, often in increments that matched monthly living expenses at first, but later ballooned to $3,600 and even $4,200 in certain months. When Ms. Patel read the bank's internal memo aloud, pattern of beneficiary transfers flagged. Authorization forms bear disputed signature of Maria Alvarez. The room seemed to inhale. There was a quiet confidence in the video Mr. Cortez played at 11:17 a.m. The footage was short but devastating. A March 11, 2024 meeting in which Elena, Anna, and Julian spoke directly about finalizing the durable power of attorney and scheduling the transfers for the 5th. Elena's face, up close on the screen, was a map of decisions made in the glow of convenience. Anna's voice trembled where the tape captured it, and you could hear the nervous, faint laughter of a man who believed money could braid guilt into silence. I watched my daughter on the screen with that peculiar detachment that comes when you see a portrait painted of yourself in someone else's colors. The sound of the tape was a rending. I had feared that they would try to explain away the handwriting, to say my signature was similar, or that age and tremor made signatures unreliable. Dr. Marina peeled those arguments apart with the patience of a seamstress undoing bad stitches. She pointed to the hesitations, the inconsistent pressure, the lack of fluency in curves that real signatures possess. She showed the library card signature where my downstrokes were confident and the T's crossed like rails. The forgery, she said plainly, bore the marks of a copied hand. The judge nodded as if listening to a piece of a larger, ancient argument, one that pushes against the small cruelties humans invent to hide themselves. Then came the witness who, more than any paper, gave the case a human face. Anna herself, brought in, fragile and bewildered, escorted with the gentleness one affords a frightened animal. She arrived on a cooler October morning, leaning on the arm of her nurse. At first she was hesitant, but when Mr. Cortez asked gently, she spoke. They told me to say Elena was the one. Her voice was thin. It sounded like something that had been used and put away. Under oath, she admitted confusion, then panic, then the pressure she felt from voices that sounded authoritative. I didn't remember, she said. They wrote things down. I signed because I thought it would stop them. The court sat very still. When a human being says such things, paperwork becomes indictment. The micro cliffhanger came when the bailiff announced a call. A new witness had arrived. The new witness was my neighbor Elvis, a wiry man with hands like a sculptor's, who came forward with an envelope filled with invoices and a peculiar series of texts he had intercepted by accident, an accidental forwarding of an email about estate settlement companies. When the bailiff read the messages, the tenor of the courtroom shifted. An account began to feel less like an arithmetic problem and more like a conspiracy with a schedule. Patterns usually make law happy. Repetition is the enzyme of proof, and ours were many and consistent. Julian's lawyer attempted to explain lapses as family arrangements, that Anna had been in legitimate need. He suggested the durable power of attorney had been signed during a compassionate moment. The defense painted a picture of benevolence, of family duty. But Mr. Cortez, with a steadiness I depended upon like the handle of an old gate, presented the bank's originals. The draft email, the video, and then, like a final, slow wind, he brought forward an expert from the public prosecutor's office. When she read aloud the criminal statute for elder financial abuse and forgery, the air in the room thickened with a legal gravity that made even small lies seem heavy. Judge Valdez's voice, measured, not unkind, called her decision. She found the durable power of attorney void for probable forgery pending further criminal investigation. She placed a permanent injunction on any funds moving from Julian's accounts to the beneficiary account at the nursing home, and she ordered an emergency hearing for restitution to consider immediate freezes. She also wrote, with that judicial exactness that can feel like a scalpel, that she would refer the matter to the district attorney for potential criminal charges. The sound of the gavel felt like the true beginning of a long process. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to breathe as if someone else had taken a weight off my chest. In the days after the hearing, life rearranged itself in strange ways. Friends who had once applauded Elena at galas now looked at me in the grocery aisle, with a softness that bordered on pity. Invitations to speak arrived, strange for a woman who had once only made lemon cake. A board of a charity that Elena chaired wrote to say they were saddened by recent events and would hold an emergency meeting. She was removed from the gala committee she had so lovingly curated. Photographs of her smiling by the marble fountain were quietly replaced on the charity's website. Julian's name was pulled from a volunteer advisory board. Social currency, it turns out, can evaporate faster than cream. For all the formal victories, nothing in the world could have prepared me for the private theater that followed. Elena came to my small house on October 20th at 5:15 p.m. She stood on the porch and looked like a person in a glass cage, perfectly arranged and terribly cracked. I opened the door and saw the same woman who had once been soothed on my lap by stories. She had a look of someone who had been surprised by her own reflection. "Mama," she said, and for a moment the old name struck me like a bell. She reached for the pearls as if to remove them. I kept them where they were. "I'm sorry," she said. But the apology was a dish I had learned to test like food for poison. It needed both taste and context. "I don't know what I was thinking," she went on. "We were scared. I thought I was helping." I looked at her and felt the complicated tapestry of motherhood. Love braided with failure and occasional foolishness. I told her simply that forgiveness is not a substitute for responsibility. "You must make amends," I told her. "Return the money. Tell the truth. Find a life that is not built on other people's silence." She promised, her words like small blue candles in a room of wind. But promises, as I had learned, are cheap until they are counted. I insisted she speak to Mr. Cortez, to the judge, to the nursing home, and most of all, to Anna. If she wanted to begin again, it would need action, not theatrical remorse. The micro cliffhanger arrived in a message. Julian had disappeared. He was not completely gone. He had simply moved his office to an address no one seemed to reach easily. News outlets called it a retreat. His mother called it a moment to reflect. The bank froze certain accounts after the judge's order. Auditors combed through ledgers and found transfers made to shell accounts and to consultants' companies that existed only on paper. The district attorney opened an investigation into potential criminal charges of elder abuse and forgery. The legal machinery moves much slower than a heart can desire, but when it grinds with teeth. Restitution, however, is not only a legal word, it is where human stories go to be healed. The judge ordered a hearing on November 3, 2024, to address the amount to be returned and whether punitive damages were appropriate. In court, the bank's compliance officer testified to the original bank authorizations. Dr. Marina reconstructed the forged strokes. Anna's nurse testified to the pressure put upon a vulnerable woman. The mosaic of evidence that once seemed a collage of small, unconnected things now read as a plan, carefully executed. Elena wept in court, and I will confess that something in me, stubborn as it is, ached. She had been my child, and the mother in me understood brokenness. But the woman in me who had guarded dignity knew that remorse without repair is a hollow monument. When the judge announced restitution, $230,000 to be returned to accounts, and placed in a protected trust for me, plus an additional $50,000 in punitive damages to be paid by Julian and Elena jointly. The sound of the clerk reading the numbers was both arithmetic and absolution. She further ordered that all attempts to amend the last will and testament that had been scheduled were void. The original will, as it had stood before those suspicious amendments, would remain in effect unless formally and legally changed, with proper witnesses and without undue influence. The judge's words felt like a closing of a dangerous door. Elena's public humiliation was complete when the charity she had chaired issued a formal apology and resigned her from the board. The micro cliffhanger came like weather. A letter arrived with a new signature. It was from Anna, this time voluntarily, this time without nervous hands guiding her. The note was short. I am sorry. I remember more now. I want help. The words were a small, blunt instrument. They did not heal everything, but confessions are beginnings. We arranged for Anna to receive proper care and to be represented with a guardian ad litem to ensure her voice was heard in the restitution process. The nursing home agreed to return unused funds, and the bank agreed to work with us on recovery. The mechanics of recovery were messy and slow, but each return check felt like a pebble in the bowl of a woman who had been made to feel hollow. In the quieter months that followed, I found myself doing things I had not expected. I met other mothers who had been marginalized by their children's new wealth. I met elders who had been coaxed into signing forms they could not understand. I began to volunteer at a hotline where older people could call and ask questions. I taught a small class at the community center on how to spot financial coercion for wills and for signatures. The mason jar on my top shelf filled again, not with the hush of secrecy, but with coins gathered at bake sales and donation jars from neighbors who had watched and decided to act. The pearls at my throat became, to some, a small emblem of a woman who refused to be invisible. Poetic justice, I learned, wears many robes. There was the legal justice, money returned, documents voided, an investigation opened. There was the social justice, embarrassed resignations, shuttered reputations, invitations withdrawn. And then there was the private justice, the one that comes not from courts, but from the rearrangement of a heart's economy. Elena's slow work to rebuild trust, the awkward apologies, the forced humility of a woman who had once measured her worth in guests and galas. For all that, it is not for me to rejoice in another's fall. I wished for repair more than ruin, but there is a sweetness in seeing a self-made world unmade by its own dishonesty. When the legal proceedings concluded formally in late November, I stood in a small hearing room and signed papers that returned my autonomy. Mr. Cortez advised me to set up a limited guardianship, not to be guarded, but to protect me from any future undue influence. A trusted attorney as durable power of attorney with a clause for independent auditing and a 3-person advisory committee comprising community members. I followed his counsel, and for the first time in many years, I felt like a woman who had both her freedom and a scaffold to keep it safe. I kept the pearls. I set aside a portion of the restitution, $25,000, to establish a small fund to help elders in my community who were vulnerable to financial coercion. It felt like planting a tree whose shade I might never fully sit under, but which I hoped others would. The resolution came not as a trumpet, but as a small, steady sun. Elena stayed away for months after the court's decision, then returned with a letter, long, awkward, honest enough to sting. She wrote of shame, of pressure, of a fear of being lesser in a world that values gilded surfaces. She wrote that she would do what she could to repay, to make amends, to go to therapy, and to work with agencies that protect the vulnerable. I accepted her apology with terms. Financial restitution, yes, but also a requirement that she volunteer at the hotline for 6 months to learn the faces behind the forms. If there is a revenge in this, it is of a certain justice. Those who wound must look upon those they have hurt. The final Dumas aside touched me in quiet moments. There is a grandeur in seeing justice serve not to humiliate, but but to educate. And the truest triumph is in remaking a life around honesty rather than around appearances. I believed then what Dumas believed, that a wrong, once unmasked, unchains more than the abused. It frees the future from repeating the same quiet tyranny. So what happened to Julian? He faded from the social circles he once haunted. He was compelled to testify to auditors and to make restitution as best the law permitted. The district attorney decided on misdemeanor charges for forgery in the first instance. Civil suits followed. The public humiliation and the financial penalties were perhaps smaller than some would have wanted, but they were firm. More importantly, the house of glass he and Elena had built cracked, then surrendered. Elena sold a number of possessions bought in haste and returned certain luxuries, gifts she had thought could replace conscience. The banners that once announced galas with her name were taken down. People whisper, life rearranges itself in the wake of uncovered truth. And me? I returned to my small kitchen with my chipped mug, to the mason jar that now held coins given by neighbors who watched and wanted to honor an old woman's grit. I washed the pearls and wore them to a small community meeting where I spoke once, not as an avenger, but as a woman who had learned a harsh lesson and chosen to turn it into a lesson for others. Be careful with signatures, I told them. Watch for the 5th of each month. Ask for originals. Trust your instincts when something smells like citrus and secrecy. They laughed, the right kind of laugh, the kind that frees you from gravity. I will not pretend this story ends with roses only. I lost time with my daughter that cannot be bought back. Family tables will bear the marks of what happened. Holidays will smell of caution for a while. And yet I gained the peculiar peace of someone who reclaimed both dignity and independence. I set up the trust with a clause that any further contested transfer of funds would require a court review, and I placed a provision ensuring that a portion of my estate would fund elder advocacy. The pearls, which once were only a memory, became a symbol of restoration. I kept the mason jar on the shelf too, as a reminder that small things make up a life, and that even a life measured in coins can be one of honor. If my story touched you, if it warmed some small place in your chest or made you check the signatures in the drawers at home, then do me a kindness. Share it with someone who needs courage. Tell your mother to look at her bank records. Show your neighbor how to spot the 5th of the month transfers. And if you have a channel where stories are told, subscribe. This old heart has many more truths to tell. We are not simply victims or villains. We are a collection of choices, and the humblest choice, truth, has the power to remake a life.